Hello.
Hello, is Dr. Chomsky online?
Yes, he is.
My name is Ram Kumar. I'm calling from Trivandrum. I have two questions for Dr. Chomsky. The first part is, could you kindly comment on how widespread is the support within the United States for the U.S. retaliation in Afghanistan? How does the U.S. citizens react to it? The second part of the question is, what do you think are the new challenges before the left movement in the United States after the events of September 11? How have the challenges and the world changed?
Thank you, Ram Kumar. Thank you. We have the question. We have the question. Thank you.
First, I would strongly suggest that you not pay too much attention to what you read in the newspapers and hear on television. Actual support, actual attitudes in the United States are much more mixed and complex than what you might expect from what you hear. People are, of course, outraged, frightened, angry, fearful. They correctly regard it as an atrocity and think that something should be done about it. If they're asked in, say, polls, should we strike at the terrorists and destroy them, most people say yes. So it looks as if there's a lot of support. On the other hand, when people are asked, should we carry out a retaliation in which innocent civilians will be harmed, the numbers go way down. If, unfortunately this is not asked because people are not supposed to think about it, but if people were asked, do you think we should be driving large numbers of people into starvation and death, virtually no one would support it. That's one of the reasons why these issues are deflected in the media, are not discussed. As for the challenges to the left, well, one challenge is the usual one. Break through the pattern of propaganda control, help people understand what is actually happening. If they understand what is actually happening, I have no doubt that there'll be massive popular opposition. Beyond that, the challenges are not new, they're old. Remember, every time there's a crisis, it can be an earthquake or a war or anything else, the battle that is constantly going on, a kind of class war that's constantly going on, one participant continues without a stop. In fact, uses the opportunity relentlessly to pursue their agenda. And that's true now too. The privileged and powerful sectors are using the sense of crisis in order to implement projects that they know they could never carry out because of public opposition. A whole range of them, from cutting corporate taxes to granting the president the authority to make executive agreements, to increasing the missile defense system and so on. These are all being pushed through rapidly, while the general population is told, you have to be patriotic and quiet and acquiescent and call off your protests and you have to disappear from the conflict. We'll continue even more strongly than before. Well, the task of the left is to resist that and to continue to face exactly the old challenges. I don't even call it the left. I mean, so for example, on the international economics agreements, what's going on in Doha, the so-called trade agreements, the overwhelming majority of the population is opposed to them. And the task of the left is just to clarify and organize and sharpen and turn that protest into something constructive and meaningful. That was a task before, it's a task now. Same on issues of militarization. The public doesn't want to have huge amounts of money spent on military systems, which will in fact be harmful to the United States as well as to everyone else. Task of the left is to, same thing, to be a spark to help organize and turn those natural and proper concerns into something useful and constructive. Beyond that, it's to organize people to dismantle the system of control and oppression, both in the economic system and the social system and elsewhere.
Hello?
Hello.
Hello, yes. Who's speaking?
Sir, I'm Rekha calling from Ernakulam.
Yes? Yes, Rekha. What is your question? Yes.
Could you kindly say something about the problems of poverty and deprivation in different parts of the world today? And also, what are the main forms of deprivation in the United States? Am I clear, sir?
Yes, you are. Thank you.
Living in India, you can tell me much more about the problems of poverty and deprivation than I can tell you. Take say food. There are ample supplies of food in the world, but they are not going to the people who need them. In India, for example, there are huge supplies of food rotting in storehouses and maybe being eaten by rats, but not going to the people who need them. And that's true worldwide. It's not a food problem, it's a social problem. It's a problem of society and its organization. And the same is true of other forms of deprivation. There are billions of people in the world who do not have clean water. That's probably the worst health problem that exists. It's easily within the capacity of contemporary available resources to overcome that. I'm for, what amount to trivial sums. These major problems could be overcome. There are probably, during the time that we are talking, there are several thousand children around the world dying from easily treatable diseases, like diarrhea. That takes a little hydration. Many of them in India, in fact, a large percentage of them in India. Well, there's certainly available resources to overcome that. The fact that we don't overcome it is a choice. It's a crime, a major crime on the part of the privileged sectors of the world, including India, the privileged sectors here and in the West and elsewhere. The problems can be overcome. The term silent genocide actually was used by the director of the United Nations World Food Program just a few days ago on World Food Day, when he described the problem of starvation throughout the world as what he called silent genocide. It's a good term. It's a genocide that can be stopped, and it extends in all sorts of ways. In the United States, this very rich country, the problems are there, but they're by no means as severe as they are in South Asia. But they're there. I mean, there are people living not far from where I live. Right in the center of the world's educational center, the peak educational center, Harvard University, Harvard Square, where it is located. You can walk around the area. There are homeless people sleeping in the streets. Sleeping in the streets in Boston is not so simple. That means sleeping in temperatures that are well below freezing overnight, with snow, in rags, with no food. Some of the people used to sleep on grates that are used for heating pipes from which heat comes out. The university removed them because it's unsightly to have people sleeping there. They should sleep where it's freezing. The United States has, among countries where there are meaningful statistics, it has the highest percentage of the population in jail in the world. That's a neoliberal achievement. That wasn't true in 1980. That's a consequence of the last 20 years of programs which have rapidly increased the number of people in jail. Those are mostly poor black and poor Hispanic people tossed into jail because they're superfluous in this form of society, the neoliberal societies. You can find the kinds of deprivation and poverty that you find massively in South Asia, which is probably the worst part of the world in this respect. You also find in the rich countries, but less dramatically because they're richer. And they're criminal no matter where they are.
Hello.
Hello?
Hello, yes.
Question ചോദിക്കാനായിരുന്നു.
ചോദിച്ചോളൂ. എന്താ പേര്?
പേരെന്താണ്?
ഗീത.
എവിടുന്നാ?
ട്രിവാൻഡ്രത്ത് നിന്ന്.
ചോദിച്ചോളൂ.
ഇംഗ്ലീഷിലാണ് ചോദിക്കുന്നത്.
ഇംഗ്ലീഷിൽ ചോദിച്ചോളൂ.
I want to know your attitude about the expression of freedom. As an American citizen, you have been traveling and expressing your views regarding imperialistic and colonialistic attitude of the US government as a state. My question is that, as an American citizen, you have the right to express yourself without much objection. But as far as India is concerned, the indigenous people suffers many types of objection regarding the freedom of expression. The left contradictory. Everything seems to be contradictory. I think it's better America who would safeguard its citizens' rights to live and also to express. I want to know about your opinion about this.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
The United States has achieved over the centuries a high degree of protection for freedom of expression. In fact, it's unique in the world in this respect. It was not given as a gift. I mentioned earlier in the program that the leading figure in U.S. labor, Eugene Debs, was in prison because he was critical of the First World War. Well, that's not freedom of expression. In fact, during any period of crisis, not serious crisis, freedom of expression has been sharply restricted. On the other hand, by comparative standards, it's quite high. However, freedom of expression, it's a right, but remember, this is a kind of a capitalist, semi-capitalist society, meaning that everything becomes a commodity. One of the things that's a commodity is freedom. A lot of it is available in principle, and you have as much of it as you can buy. And so if you're relatively privileged, you have a lot. In fact, one of the reasons freedom of expression is protected because the rich and powerful are the primary beneficiaries of it. On the other hand, if you're a poor black child in the ghetto, and you may technically have freedom of expression, but if the police pick you up and throw you in jail, there's nothing you can do about it, though you had freedom of expression. Indigenous people, it's the same. They technically have the right to speak, but the opportunities are not there, and harsh repression can come without anybody noticing it if they go too far. I mean, there's a lot of, everyone's heard of Watergate, terrible crime. Watergate is considered a terrible crime. It was a very minor event, actually, because the people who were under attack in Watergate were rich, powerful people, and they had minor difficulties, and that's considered an outrage. At the same time as Watergate, a black organizer, one of the leading black organizers, Fred Hampton, was murdered by the police and the FBI in a raid that could have been run by the Gestapo. 4 o'clock in the morning, the police broke in with FBI assistance and murdered him in bed. Well, that's not considered a crime. You didn't hear about that one, I'm sure. And that was at the same time as Watergate. So yes, there's freedom of expression, and it's an important thing. I don't think it's insignificant. It took centuries to achieve it. I mean, it wasn't until about 30 years ago, in the context of the civil rights movement, that the courts actually recognized freedom of expression as a right for the first time. That's recent. And it was the result of a lot of struggle, and it's a wonderful achievement. On the other hand, we should recognize, as I think you're saying, that it's a formal right which is beneficial to those who are in a position to use it, and is available much less to those who live under conditions of oppression and domination. And I'm sure same is true in India, but in a more extreme form.
Hello?
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 Hello, yes. Hello, who's speaking?
Chomsky?
Yes.
Hello?
Who's speaking?
Chomsky online?
Yes. Who is speaking?
This is Vikas Raval from Trivandrum.
Yes.
Can I give my question?
Yes, you may, please.
Professor Chomsky, you've written about how the attacks of September 11 have exposed the fallacy of the Bush government's plan of national missile defense. India has the dubious distinction of being one of the first countries to support the United States on NMD. What, in your opinion, does NMD hold for the future of this world?
You're quite right that the events of September 11th illustrated the irrelevance of national missile defense to any defensive purpose. But that, in fact, had been known before. It was well understood that they're much more, if anyone wants to set off, say, a nuclear explosion in the United States, they're not going to send it by a missile, and unless they have an urge for massive self-destruction. I mean, if you want to, say, set off a nuclear explosion in the United States, what you would do is take a 15-pound plutonium bomb, put it in a suitcase, sneak it across the Canadian border somewhere, and blow up New York City. That can't be stopped. No one will send a missile. The National Missile Defense Program has essentially nothing to do with defense. When the word defense is used, you should hear offense. So every country has a defense department which is designed for offensive purposes. And the same is true of national missile defense. It's an offensive weapon. And it's in fact part of a much broader system of militarization of space, which the United States has been pursuing. You're right, India was the first country to enthusiastically indicate support for it, although the foreign minister backed off and said he had been misinterpreted, so I don't know exactly what India's position is. This program, there is an outer space treaty signed in 1967, which has been enforced. Nobody's violated it. It's clear to the world now. It bans any military weapons in space. It's clear to the world that the United States intends to violate that treaty. Therefore, it has come up at the United Nations for the last few years for a vote. And it's been a unanimous vote in favor of it, except for the United States and Israel, which have abstained. They don't want to vote against it, but they haven't reaffirmed it because the U.S. intends to violate it and Israel goes along. Maybe India will go along next time. There are programs in place to try to place offensive weapons in space. That's part of what's called the National Missile Defense Program. Maybe I should make a technical point. If anybody believed in national missile defense seriously, they would understand the dilemma that arises. Missile defense program relies on satellites. It relies crucially on satellite communication in order to control it. It's very easy to shoot down satellites. That's a lot easier than shooting down missiles. You know where they are, they don't move around, and so on. So anti-satellite weapons are the poor man's weapon. Any country with some technical capacity can develop them. Therefore, if the United States wants to have a missile defense system, it's going to have to prevent anti-satellite weapons from working, which means it has to have such overwhelming dominance of space and the world that no country can even use the poor man's weapon. That's even if you believe in the missile defense. Over and above that, their goal, and they say it very clearly, it's not a secret, it's public, is to develop space weapons which function exactly the way navies functioned in the past. So in past years, the British Navy was developed to protect British commercial interests, investment, access to resources, control over other countries, and so on. That was the purpose of the British Navy. A lot of the background reason for the conquest of India was for Britain to get an opium monopoly, which it used, in fact, the revenue from it was used to support the British Navy, to control the empire. Now, the U.S. intends to carry that forward. The day of navies is over. We're now in the days of space. So we want space forces to protect U.S. interests, investment, resource access, and so on worldwide. That is explicit policy. I'm just quoting from high-level planning documents. And they expect this to be even more necessary in the future than it is now because of the effects of what they call globalization. It is assumed that the form of globalization that they're instituting through the World Trade Organization and others is going to lead to a widening divide, more poor people and a small number of rich people. So that's predicted. And if there's a growing mass of impoverished people around the world, they're likely to become unruly and disruptive and do things that the powerful don't want. So therefore we need powerful forces, space-based military forces, which will control them just the way armies and navies and the Air Force controlled them in the past. This is the next frontier for controlling the world. It's completely open and overt. If everyone doesn't know about it, it's because the media and the intellectuals choose not to let the population know. There's no secret about these documents. They are publicly available. The highest level documents and the programs are being implemented. It's called defense, but everything's called defense. That's the National Missile Defense Program. So it's perfectly true, to get back to your point, that the September 11th attacks wouldn't have been stopped by this, but nobody cares, because that's not what it's for. It's for a different purpose. That's why it's immediately escalated in the window of opportunity given by the fear and concern of the public when resistance doesn't subsides.
Hello.
Hello.
Yes.
Am I speaking to respected Noam Chomsky?
Yes. What is your name? Where are you speaking
I
from?
am Suresh Paul from Kottayam.
Suresh Babu from Kottayam. Yes. Go ahead and ask your question, Mr. Suresh Babu.
Sir, so such a terrorist who is protected by a country which is ruled by a religious fanatics and which is almost full of illiterate and very religious people who are also supporting him. So my question is whether he should be killed for his terrorist activities all over the world. If yes, how is it possible without doing any harm to the innocent people in Afghanistan?
Well,
Yes.
First of all, Osama bin Laden, in fact, did not admit anything. At least what was reported was that he described the actions on September 11th as legitimate, and he said that when we carry out terror to defend ourselves, the Muslim lands and people, that's legitimate terror, but when others attack us, that's illegitimate terror. That's not taking responsibility for anything. It's possible that he's involved, it's possible that he's not involved, and we know nothing more about that than we knew yesterday. The position that should he be killed, should someone who says that terror is legitimate be killed? Well, if you really believe that, there are a lot of people who are going to have to be killed. I mean, you have to start with George W. Bush, and then go to Tony Blair, and then go to your own government. They're all going to have to be killed because they all say exactly what Osama bin Laden says, namely, terror is legitimate if we carry it out. So the people who are saying that right now, that the attack on Afghanistan is just and legitimate and maybe regrettable but necessary, they're all saying that massive terror is good, is fine, as long as we're carrying it out. So if the principle is that someone who claims that terror is legitimate has to be killed, we can start right here. We don't have to worry about Osama bin Laden. And furthermore, they're talking about much worse terror. The atrocities on September 11th were bad enough, but what the world leaders, with India's support, are doing to the people of Afghanistan is far worse in terms of numbers and scale and disaster and so on. Furthermore, the people who are leading this crusade happen to be the world's leading terrorists. Remember, the United States is the only country in the world, that has been condemned by the World Court for international terrorism, ordered to desist, and then dismissed the order and went on. It's the only country in the world that, it vetoed a Security Council resolution calling on it to observe international law. When Donald Rumsfeld comes to India and talks about crushing terror, remember, he was part of a government. He was an official in a government, the Reagan administration, which was condemned for international terrorism by the World Court and then continued it and escalated it. It's war against Nicaragua. So the war against terrorism is being led by some of the leading, maybe the leading terrorists in the world, and they regard terror as legitimate, including the terror they're now carrying out. Well, let's take the specific case of Osama bin Laden. If he is responsible for terrorist acts, there's a way to deal with that. The way to deal with it is there are legal measures to deal with a criminal. So suppose let's take a small problem. Suppose somebody robs my home, and I think I know who it is. I think it's someone on the other side of the city who probably did it. Am I supposed to take an assault rifle and go murder everybody in his neighborhood? I mean, is that the right way to respond to the fact that I think he's responsible? No. The right way to respond is to use the system of justice that's available, find evidence. If you can get legitimate evidence, try to get the person who's involved, bring him to justice, and look into the background grievances that led to the robbery in the first place. They're always there. That would be the right approach in this case, too. Why is the United States not following that approach? Well, several reasons. For one thing, they don't have the evidence. For another thing, they do not want authorization. The United States is not going to the Security Council and saying, give us authorization to carry out a military attack. They could get that authorization from the Security Council, but they don't want it. They don't want it because they want to retain the authority to act unilaterally without authorization. And that's what it means to be a terrorist state. You do not want authorization. You know, if you're the head of a criminal gang, you don't want authorization from the police to do what you do. You want to do it on your own because you don't need authorization. So yes, the criminal states want to act violently on their own and therefore are not pursuing the legitimate means that are available. And they are available. Other countries have used them. So take, say, Nicaragua, small country. It was under attack by the United States for 10 years. That attack was very serious. Killed tens of thousands of people, practically destroyed the country, may never recover. They did not respond by setting off bombs in Washington, which they could have done. They responded by going to the World Court with a case saying the United States is attacking us, carrying out an international terrorist attack against us, we want you to order them to stop. The World Court, which is the highest judicial body in the world, listened to their case, accepted it, rejected the U.S. response, ordered the United States to terminate the international terrorist attack. Well, of course, the U.S. dismissed that and escalated the attack. Nicaragua went to the Security Council, which tried to pass a resolution, but the U.S. vetoed it. Well, okay, at that point, Nicaragua couldn't do anything. It's a small, weak country. If the United States pursued the legal course, nobody would stop it. In fact, everyone would applaud. But as I say, it doesn't want to do it because it does not want to have the authorization. Like any criminal, it wants to have everyone understand that I'm going to act without authorization. You better be afraid of me. If there were a concern to, say, extradite Osama bin Laden, it could probably be done. We don't know for certain. But the Taliban did offer to negotiate. They offered to negotiate the question of extradition of bin Laden. In fact, what they said is, present us with some evidence and we will consider extradition. It's exactly what any other country would do. I mean, if someone came to India, let's say, and said, you have someone in India who I think is a criminal, so send him over to me and I'll take care of him. Would India do it? Of course not. No, they'd say, okay, present us with your evidence and we'll consider it, and if it looks legitimate, yeah, we'll extradite him. But the U.S. Doesn't want to pursue that course. When the Taliban offered to negotiate and asked for evidence, George Bush stood up on television and said, you know, we're not going to pay any attention to you, we'll bomb you. We don't want to give you evidence, none of your business. We say, give them to us, so give them to us. Well, you know, that is a way of demonstrating that they do not want him extradited. They do not want to solve the issue by peaceful means. Would it have worked? Were the Taliban serious? Well, you know, we really don't know. There's only one way to find out, and that's to pursue the offers, which the U.S. didn't want to do. So yes, there might well be a way to deal with Osama bin Laden by legal, proper procedures, but the West doesn't want to follow it. For one reason, because they don't have the evidence, and for another, because they want everyone to understand that they have the authority granted by themselves to act violently without any authorization.
Hello.
Hello, could I speak to Mr. Chomsky?
Yes, what is
State your name? Where are you calling from?
I am Murali calling from Palkad, sir.
Good. Murali, what is your question? Go ahead.
Yeah, my question is, what do you think is the truth about the Anthrax scare in United States? Is it a problem that has been blown out of proportion by the media and the U.S. establishment?
Excellent. Thank you.
Well, the anthrax problem is quite real. Someone is sending anthrax, which is a deadly poison, to people in the United States. It's the FBI, the criminal investigation system, has been spending all of its resources trying to trace this. They cannot find out who did it. They have no idea who did it. Somebody's doing it, probably somebody inside the United States. They don't know why, they don't know who, they don't know where it's coming from. And people are frightened, which is perfectly legitimate. The number of people killed happens to be small, it's a handful, but people are afraid. That tells you something. Imagine if they cannot find inside the United States, with all of the police resources available, the source of a letter that is mailed from, they know the post office from which it was mailed and so on and so forth. Imagine the difficulty of finding out who was responsible for the September 11th bombing. You know, it's true that they can't find out who, but that's an immensely more difficult problem, and they can't do it. Even the anthrax threat has not been identified, with all of the country's resources being devoted to it, and it's internal to the United States. So yes, the fear is very real and understandable, and they do not know the answer.
Is it blown out of proportion?
Is it blown out of proportion? Well, I don't know. People are afraid, and rightly afraid. It's true that a handful of people have been killed, but you never know whether the next piece of mail you're picking up is going to have anthrax spores in it. And that is enough to frighten people. Of course, in most of the world, they're facing threats far beyond that, you know. But this is a threat, a real threat, that rich and privileged people are facing who aren't used to threats. They're used to threats being somewhere else.
I think one thing implied in the question by Murali was, what is this linked to? Is the anthrax scare linked to September 11th, and what are the connections?
Nobody has any idea. The FBI doesn't know, the CIA doesn't know, nobody knows. So your guess is as good as anyone else's. The current assumption is it's probably something in the United States, maybe a reaction to September 11th, but it could be some crazy person somewhere who decided to react to September 11th by frightening people. You know, that kind of thing happens, unfortunately.
Thank you. Before we end, we have to end this program now. And I would like to thank our two panelists, N. Ram and Sashi Kumar, for their participation in it. And I'm sure that Ram and Sashi join me in thanking Professor Chomsky for this very special opportunity
Thank you very much.
and conversation. Thank you, Noam.